Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people. Very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith, and this week I am joined by Spencer Sunshine, who is a longtime anti-fascist researcher and the author of the new book, Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism, The Origins and Afterlife of James Mason's Siege. Spencer, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show again.
I guess just to begin with, maybe for listeners who aren't familiar with you, could you tell us a little bit about your history as an anti-fascist researcher?
Sure. I've been doing this work for about 20 years now, which sort of pains me to say. I was involved in a group in 1990, which today would probably be called an anti-fascist group, to combat the influence of Nazi skinheads. I live in the States. I grew up in Georgia in the Deep South. Combat the influence of the Nazi skinheads in the punk scene there. I came back to doing this work and started in earnest in 2005 when we found the presence of national anarchists, who are a kind of unusual crypto-fascist group. We're cross-recruiting from anarchists and radical ecologist elements of the anti-globalization movement in the States, but where they're based in Britain. There was a group established in Australia and I believe New Zealand. And then after that, I just got more and more interested in questions about anti-Semitism and the far right, and especially when Trump was elected, you know, and the alt-right happened, I sort of chased that down the rabbit hole, and I've done this work now full-time for almost 10 years.
The new book about the origins and afterlife of James Mason's Siege, for our listeners who hopefully are not aware of who James Mason is, could you tell us who is James Mason?
If your listeners aren't aware of him, I envy them so much. Ignorance is bliss. So James Mason's Siege is an unusual case in which there's almost a singular text animating, albeit small, political movement. These are the various called siege culture and accelerationists. It's a new wave of neo-Nazis. It's kind of scary. It's been going on about 10 years now. The Iron March Forum, which originally a lot of them came out of, was established in 2015. And it includes groups like the Atomwaffen Division and the groups that splintered out of it and copycatted it. And I believe the Antipode Resistance in Australia is part of this network. And these are people who are Zoomers and millennials who espouse and sometimes practice terrorism. They believe there's no point in doing legal political work, even in having a lot of the issues the right wing have. They've tried to break themselves off from a traditional white supremacy or conservative politics. And so they espouse either dropping out of society entirely or engaging in terrorism in hopes of collapsing the whole system, in which case then they'll have a chance to seize power. Mason, they sort of fetishize James Mason. He is now in his 70s. He's been a National Socialist since 1966 when he joined the American Nazi Party, which for readers unfamiliar with American fascism, it does what it says on the tin. It was the first open neo-Nazi post-war party. In the early mid-'80s, he wrote a series of newsletters called Siege. There were 6 pages. They were mimeographed about his experiences in the National Socialist movement, and he developed a new philosophy, basically venerated the cult leader Charles Manson, who he befriended as the new neo-Nazi leader after Hitler. He espoused and promoted people engaging in guerrilla warfare, in mass, in random massacres and serial killers. At the time, there were a number of neo-Nazis and other like similar racists who were committing murders in the United States that inspired him, as well as it's the States and guns are everywhere. So there are always these massacres going on. He liked the very racialized ones. And he espoused this as the way forward. And so he was a very marginal guy, even by neo-Nazi standards. His Siege ran at less than 100 copies an issue. I found the last mailing list. He gave it to some other people when he shut down. It had 66 names on it, and those included the trades he was doing with other publications. But this book was made into a book in the early 90s, a group of countercultural. That's the first part of the book, the neo-Nazi terrorism. The second part, the countercultural fascism. What happened is he got discovered by a group of 80s and 90s countercultural figures, musicians, and publishers. Boyd Rice, who's an industrial musician, Michael Moynihan, known for his neo-folk band Blood Axis, Nicholas Schreck, who's a Satanist. He was also a musician, but he was married to Anton LaVey's daughter, Zena LaVey. Anton founded the Church of Satan, obviously a Satanist group. And Adam Parfrey, who became a very well-known publisher, had a publishing house called Feral House. He was so well-known when he died, he had like a long obituary in the New York Times, which did not mention his hand in discovering and promoting James Mason. And so these guys found Mason. They used the underground like fanzine and publishing and music network of the 80s to sort of like slowly start to publish him and introduce him. And this culminated with Moynihan editing the newsletters and publishing himself Siege in 1993. It wasn't it made a little blip. It was republished once in 2003 by these two guys, one of whom was Greg Johnson, who's well known now and publishes a Countercurrents website. And then it really just a very marginal thing until it was rediscovered in 2015 by Iron March. These guys found Mason himself and they reissued Siege. And now they hang out. Various ones go to Mason's apartment in Denver, Colorado and hang out with him. There's all these pictures, including of murderers like Samuel Woodward, who's on trial for killing a gay Jewish man right now. Woodward and others and Adam Waffen hanging out with Mason and, he just revels in it these days. So that's the thumbnail of who Mason is and the quick overview of my book. So you see the outline of the book.
The book starts with this sort of really detailed history of neo-Nazism in the 60s and 70s. You noted that this was not a lot of this was written down already. Why do you think that was? And what were some of the challenges that you had in unpacking the lineage of neo-Nazism in the US in the 70s?
So there were two things that really drove me to write this book. And as I've said elsewhere, the book took me 5 years to do. And a lot of it was based on an archive of the James N. Mason papers at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas. And they hold 60 boxes of correspondence that Mason had sold them, plus magazines, these, little small circulation National Socialist periodicals from the 70s in particular, impossible to get hold of anywhere else. And there's no other thing like this. And it's a slice of National Socialist life in the U.S., especially in the 70s and into the 80s. Mason was an inveterate collector. He, at a time that all business had to be done over letter, like internal business and ideological discussions and personal things, right? There were no emails, no text. So you had to do it this way unless you were talking on the phone, which was expensive, of course, nationally to make phone calls. And he saved not just all of his letters, his carbon copies of his outgoing letters. And he was a deep, deep insider. His mentor was William Pierce when he was in the American Nazi Party, who, of course, is famous for the Turner Diaries. And he kind of knew everyone and he wrote everyone at one point or another. So there's this incredible slice of life, amongst neo-Nazis that were in this archive that are not available anywhere else. People didn't keep their papers, or their papers were destroyed in raids or seized by the FBI or whoever. And so reading them and looking at the magazines, I was able to understand that there was a whole wing of neo-Nazism that wasn't documented in the 70s. So first off, history books in the States of American neo-Nazism or American white supremacist groups are pretty thin. Even now, where there's a deluge of literature about the far right, there's really very little historical stuff, at least about the really hardline white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Some of it's more general history of the far right in the U.S. or the Klan or somewhat more mainstream stuff. And so even at the time, there was very little written. What is written combines neo-Nazis with white supremacists. There's a couple biographies of George Lincoln Rockwell, but nothing else around the party that he founded. There's little bits and pieces here and there. And what I found is that The bits and pieces some of them were wrong, some of them were kind of right, and some of them were right. But reading them because of this, I never could tell what was right or wrong. There was lots of wrong information. Some of it was sloppy work. Some of it was monitors got their information from the neo-Nazis themselves who had lied about whether they founded a group or when the group was founded or whatever. So I try to unpack all this, and this was important because what happened, and this is crucial for James Mason, is so the American Nazi Party, as I said, was the first post-war openly National Socialist party. It was founded in 1959. There was a precursor group in 58. Led by George Lincoln Rockwell, very charismatic guy for that scene. He attracted a lot of media attention, but the party wasn't big. He was assassinated in 1967. His place was taken over by a subordinate named Matthias Kahle. Kahle was not a charismatic guy. And so at first people followed him, but as the 70s went on, a lot of people left the party. A couple left around 1970. This included William Pierce, who went on to form the National Alliance, which at one point became the biggest neo-Nazi party in the U.S. in the 90s. Also a guy, Frank Collin, he founded a group called the NSPA, who was very famous in the U.S. for the Skokie incident. They wanted to march. They were rallying in a neighborhood in Chicago resisting desegregation and could, I think, a couple times pulled 1,000 or 2,000 people to the rallies. They are Australian listeners might know them if you've seen the film The Blues Brothers. When Jake and Elroy run over the Illinois Nazis on the bridge, this is actually supposed to be Colin and his group, the NSPA. So these are two important things. And then between 73 and 74, all these people splinter off the party and leave, and they found their own groups. And so Mason leaves around this time in 75. And then all of these little groups try to see if they can work together, and they want to compete and outcompete the parent party. Its name is NSWPP. There's a zillion acronyms here. I'll try not to throw too many at you. And then Mason gets influenced by one of the groups, and such goes on. But what I found out is a number of these groups that splintered from the American Nazi Party, NSWPP, embraced a terrorist outlook. They couldn't do it in the party. It banned it. But it was William Pierce did. James Mason did. He founded a group called the NSM. The Joseph Tomasi and the National Socialist Liberation Front, which were sort of a key group because they looked and sounded like a new left terrorist group, like the Symbionese Liberation Army or the Weather Underground, and this influenced Mason, as well as a character named Joseph Paul Franklin, who became a neo-Nazi serial killer. He killed up to 22 people, and his most famous victim who escaped murder was Larry Flynt, the publisher of Hustler. And there's a movie about Flynt called The People versus Larry Flynt. And a fun fact is Flynt was assassinated in the little town in Georgia I grew up in, like a mile from my house, or he tried to assassinate him. So there became this whole wing of people, and none of this is documented. It was so fascinating to me. There's a little bit stuff about Pierce. There's no like real standalone book about Pierce except a sycophantic biography. You know, even the NSPA, there's little bits because the Skokie incident was so famous, like bits and pieces about them in books. And there was no book about Mason, no book about the NSLF, and just little pieces in articles and other stuff. And no standalone book about the NSWPP or really neo-Nazism, specifically in the 70s. There are two manuscripts that do cover this as a larger thing. One was written by Martin Kerr, who heads the group that used to be the NSWPP, American Nazi Party. It's about 8 essays that are the history of National Socialism in America. The other one is the dissertation of Jim Salam, another Australian, who wrote a history of, I think, post-war National Socialism in America, a little oddly. And he has the best accounting, but it's still a couple chapters. So there isn't a lot of scholarship on this in the States or about this period by others. When it does, it collapses white supremacy, other white supremacist groups with neo-Nazis. The things that exist are garbled information. And so, and nothing distinguishes that as this parent party splintered, like a number of people developed a terrorist wing. Like sometimes the individuals are talked about, but not talked about together. So that was fascinating to me. And it did take a long time because I had to correct details. Like there's so much incorrect information that I had to like show some fairly prominent platforms like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. I had to show that their work was wrong in these things. And then there were groups with the same names. It was very difficult to untangle them, like the National Socialist Movement. Mason founded this group, and in his biography, the standard biography, they imply the group folded. And in actuality, it didn't. It became at one point the largest American neo-Nazi party in the U.S., but they had reneged on what Mason wanted and become its opposite. So he doesn't ever admit that he was a co-founder of this group, but they still exist. So I had to untangle this stuff. There's like a zillion groups with the same names. And that took me a long time. I was very interested in it. I wanted to set the record straight. I wanted people to look at this movement and have a better understanding of it. I thought this period of splintering of the party laid the groundwork for this sort of decentralized neo-Nazism that we have today. That wasn't the case in the 50s and 60s. It was oriented around a single party. And I'm a sectologist. I love, I can tell you all about Trotskyist sects in the 20th century. And so I wanted to learn the same thing about National Socialist sects.
You're listening to Yeah Nah Passaran on 3CR, 8:55 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital on your DAB radio. We're currently talking to Spencer Sunshine about James Mason. Yeah, it certainly doesn't help that they're not very creative in their naming conventions.
Oh my God, I have a list at the beginning of all the acronyms, and they're almost exactly the same. I messed the acronyms up in the book, and I had to try to go through them with a fine-tooth comb, and I'm sure there's still some errors in there.
James Mason advocated a particular brand of violence. It seems that it was a little bit more pronounced than some of his contemporaries. Could you tell us a little bit about what that philosophy involved?
Sure. So other people in this his contemporaries in this terrorist wing, who advocated violence, they wanted more traditional political violence, like Tomasi's NSLF. They wanted guerrilla bands, like guerrilla neo-Nazis, like the FOCO. They were going to take over certain areas, and, the group would build up and they take over the central parts of the country. And Pierce, who inspired the Order, an actual white supremacist terrorist group, had a more traditional idea about people starting a white supremacist revolution. There'd be guerrilla groups, and there'd be it would be focused, and they'd be working together. Mason had a very different idea. He didn't think you could seize power. For him, he was inspired by a series of murders that started in the mid-'70s by people who are neo-Nazis or identified as neo-Nazis. And he took these, instead of other neo-Nazis being who are real conservative socially, oh, these people are just wing nuts, and they're mentally ill people. We don't be associated with them. Mason was how can we use these people? How can we embrace them? And so out of part of this, he developed not a ideology of movement building in which violence was involved, but of more random violence. These sort of just one massacre he venerates is this guy who went into a McDonald's, the San Ysidro massacre, and just killed 25 people. He was in passing accused of being a Nazi, and so Mason alighted on this and praises him. But it was just a bunch of random things that he hoped would destabilize society. So it wasn't a political movement that was going to seize power. It was the use of violence was a sort of random destabilization. And as part of this, he just praised he just got into really extreme things. So he's into serial killers. He's into Charles Manson. Manson himself, although it's often overlooked, was a racist and an anti-Semite. He had a swastika carved in his head, and he was certainly willing to play ball with James Mason. I found out in my research that Manson had actually had an alliance with the Aryan Brotherhood, this extremely violent prison gang, at one point. So Charlie had no issue working with Nazis already by the time he met Mason. So there's this violence becomes, of course, the underlying theme of this is violence is good for its own sake. Although he doesn't say that, he gives a political gloss on it. But this stuff all bleeds very easily into the edgelord stuff. Mason also started hanging out with a bunch of Satanists. So Satanism's in here. And he got in legal trouble a number of times for taking photographs of 14 and 15, maybe 16-year-old girls, and apparently had predilections for much younger ones as well. So it was just this whole collection of extremities, of extreme things that he bundled together and gave a political argument for.
The Charles Manson thing is a bit weird, and it seems that his contemporaries thought it was a bit weird as well. How was it received, this long-haired hippie that was supposed to be the next Hitler?
Well, basically, nobody liked it. Even the few people who supported him, like Tom Metzger, who's a very important figure in 80s U.S. white supremacy, endorsed violence. His followers committed violence and murder. Even he helped Mason, liked Mason, promoted Mason, put him on the cover of his magazine, sold copies of Siege. Even he was not into the Charles Manson thing. At one point he asked Mason, he's like, hey, I want to reprint this article, but I want to take the Charlie stuff out. Mason agreed. He's a fairly mellow guy as far as interacting with other people, publicly goes. And so, yeah, nobody liked it, but it was important early on because when these counterculture people discovered him, it was because of the Charlie thing. I'll call him Charlie just because you start saying Mason Manson, it becomes confusing, like the NSWPP versus the NSWPP versus the NSWWP. Real acronyms of splits in the book. So these guys that were into the early industrial scene, there was a sort of twin fetish. There was a real fetish around Charles Manson, Throbbing Gristle, the main seminal industrial band in particular, had this interest, and sometimes with Hitler as well. And so they all shared this interest in Charlie, and that's why they contacted Mason in the first place. He was first found by Boyd Rice, again, a cult industrial musician, still alive. Can't wait till he reads the book and has something to say about this because he's spent decades trying to cover this period of his life up. Met a Nazi at a gun show named Victor Malik. Malik gave him, I think, a copy of Siege, or gave him Mason's address. Rice contacts him and is like, I'm totally into the Hitler Manson thing. Let me introduce you to all these other people. They're also really interested in Charles Manson. And basically what happened is there was this sort of vogue for Manson. It built over the 80s and sort of peaked in the early 90s. Like Sonic Youth has a song about Manson they did with Lydia Lunch called Death Ride 69. Nine Inch Nails was interested in some of this stuff, and it culminates in the Guns N' Roses album on the Spaghetti Incident. They record a Manson song. There was a popular shirt called Charlie Can't Surf. This happened while I was in college and undergraduate, and I remember this very clearly because my girlfriend at the time was super into the weird Charlie fetish thing. And so when Siege came out, it came out at the height of the popularity of that. So they were able to, even though the Nazis hated the Charles Manson thing and it was incredibly unpopular, it was key to him encountering this other group of people who were really into Charlie. And they're the ones who discovered him. They're the ones who published his stuff in the 80s. They're the ones who created his book and then used the underground culture, the fanzine network, the music networks to distribute the book initially. So there was a give and a take. The Manson stuff's not so important today. Some people are interested in it. Some are not. Charlie actually died while I was writing the book, which was sort of interesting. A number of the people did. Tom Metzger did. Adam Parfrey did. But so, yeah, it's been unimportant and important. Now it's of moderate. I mean, if it wasn't in there now, I don't think it would really affect what's going on with the Siege culture, people.
Yeah, so you had these countercultural figures, the Abraxas people. So people like Boyd Rice, Michael Moynihan. I think there's very interesting in the book. Kids today don't understand. They don't know about rewinding tapes with pencils, and they don't know about how there's not receipts on everything back in the 80s and 90s. So you've got this guy, Boyd Rice, who is more than dabbling with the Nazi stuff. But there's there's one photo of him with a Nazi from this teen girl magazine that has come out. And so he's been sort of, dodging the issue for a few decades now.
Yep.
Probably wasn't expecting you to find all of the letters he sent to James Mason with swastikas and things on them.
I'm sure he's not expecting. I'm still waiting to see if this has come to his attention. I actually have a video specifically about Boyd Rice summarizing my findings and showing his handwritten letters to James Mason that'll be coming out next week. So, yeah, Rice is in particular. When I went into this archive, there's one thing. The one thing I found all these the Nazi sect arguments and how it was constructed and stuff. All these splinter groups. The other was these guys. I knew who they were, and we knew that Moynihan had made the book. That was clear. Moynihan also denied being a Nazi, but he's always been an ethno-separatist. So there's a little less question with him, right? But Adam Parfrey and Boyd Rice have always denied any serious involvement with the scene, even though Parfrey's thanked in Siege. And there are other people that got involved in this too, like Thomas Thorne, who was in a band that was very popular at one point in my life with the Thrill Kill Cult. He was a touring member of the band and then later formed a group called the Electric Hellfire Club. And I actually saw Boyd Rice and Electric Hellfire Club play. So I was very much like around these people and into this music and stuff. But Rice has always denied his connections. There's a picture of him from early '89 with Bob Hike, who was in the first national, who's the leader of what was the first national Nazi skinhead group in the U.S. called the American Front. Hike was in cahoots with Tom Metzger. Rice always denied that the picture was in Sassy magazine, which was very popular at the time. Really meant anything. He was like, oh, that guy was just a friend of mine. He's in a uniform of the American Front holding a knife. They're both in American Front uniforms. He's like, oh, that was like a joke, or, they just invited me. I was supposed to come with a bunch of people. And at the photo shoot, they said they have all this beer and food. And I was the only one who showed up. And for years and decades, this has gone back and forth. This is the evidence against him. And, he's got his occult around him and his defenders. He's never done anything wrong. It's all a joke, or it's just dabbling in extremes. He never could possibly have any serious interest in this stuff. More recently, in the last few years, an interview with him with Tom Metzger, he used to have a TV show on cable access in the U.S., an interview with him with Metzger from a couple of years before came out. And as far as I know, Rice has not addressed that. But what I found in the letters is his close connection with James Mason, which is absolutely never discussed because he's not mentioned in Siege, because I think he had a falling out with Moynihan. I asked Mason about this. Mason actually replied to a couple letters I had with 50 questions. Rice played a super important role in finding Mason, in knitting Mason together with all these other guys, including Moynihan, who was a friend of his. They lived together for a couple of years. In fact, Siege was being edited by Michael Moynihan while he was living with Boyd Rice. If anyone's ever heard the Music, Martinis, and Misanthropy album, it is recorded at that time while Siege is being edited, partly in Denver. So there's been all this stuff about Rice for decades and decades, alleged neo-Nazi. He's either been called a neo-Nazi, or it's always an alleged thing every time it gets in the papers. He tried to have an art show in New York in 2018, and this was a big argument in the art press. The show did get canceled at the end of the day, but it was always like alleged neo-Nazi and like he says, she says. So I was like, I'm going to settle this argument. Like, Rice is sending these handwritten letters. They have swastikas on them. He signs them with 8/8. He's talking about our projects. At one point, they put together these national benefits for Charles Manson to try to pay for a lawyer to get him out on parole. And it's got all the cities listed, and it's the little town Mason lives in, and, Rice's location in San Francisco. So they're truly in cahoots. Rice goes and visits Mason at his house. When Mason moves to Colorado, he's living a couple hours from Moynihan and Rice. They lived in Denver, Colorado. So he's closely connected to him and connected to Metzger. He doesn't just do this one-off in '86. He stays in contact with him for at least a decade. And I don't have Metzger-Rice correspondence. This is just what's mentioned in the James Mason correspondence about the two guys. So he's deeply embedded in these networks for quite a while. And the Hike stuff where he says, I met him once. I found like a video. It was broadcast on national TV of him and Hike being interviewed. Hike speaking, and it's incredible. Rice is behind him, crossing out. It's like a roll bar on a store, crossing out where it's written "Destroy Racism." He crosses it out with a pen, and then he draws a swastika behind this Nazi skinhead leader while it's being, filmed for national TV. It's really kind of incredible stuff.
You have this rediscovery of the work in the sort of mid-20s. How does that come about?
Well, Siege had been sort of obscurely known on the edge of things. The first edition is 93, I believe. I didn't put this in the book. I found out later. They made like 1,000 copies, which makes sense. And after a few years, it sold out. There was a new edition in 2003 of 500 copies. In 2006, someone digitized it and put it online, which is probably where most people ran into it because the copies are very expensive. And then it was reissued by the Iron March people, I think in 2017, finally. So, Siege had been known because I knew about it. It was notorious because Moynihan was a known figure in the neofolk scene, and there's always been attention, partly because of the band Death in June, to fascist elements in the neofolk scene. And I was around this, so I was familiar with the argument. Moynihan would tour, and there'd be protests from anti-fascists who try to shut this stuff down. Again, always alleged Nazi or alleged racist, and he would always dodge things. He was an important figure as he co-wrote the book Lords of Chaos, which is a very popular book about the Norwegian black metal scene and Varg Vikernes. of Burzum. And so at one point he became quite well known. And so he needed to dodge being labeled a Nazi, right? And, he tried to downplay his connection to Mason. And so it was a text that wasn't totally unknown. If you were involved in neo-Nazi circles, especially the pro-terrorist ones, you would run across it, or you'd run across mention of it, and then it was on a website called Solar General. You could just Google it. So it wasn't totally unknown. It just was a very extremely marginal thing.
Some of James Mason's local adherents last year made a bit of a splash when they appeared at a turf rally in Melbourne with a sign about destroying pedophiles. As you mentioned, James Mason was a pedophile. It's sort of funny in the book. There's a whole section of, it's a bit like in Genesis when everyone's begatting everyone. You have this person went to jail and this person took over, then that person was shot in the head, and then this person took over, and then this person went to jail also for being a pedophile. There's quite a lot of pedophiles involved. What's going on there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's clear Mason, again, has never been convicted of pedophilia. It's very clear in his letters. He's very into it. At one point, he writes his friend Ed Reynolds, probably the only other guy he works with who's into Charles Manson, but Reynolds is sort of dropping out of the movement on some level, that he would like to see a talk show about fathers and daughters who, are like sleeping with each other or want to have children together. And he's like, I'm all for this as long as they're both white. So yeah, he is. It's a great quote. The book is riddled with pedophiles. Frank Collin, the guy who I said did the Skokie incident and is ridiculed in the Blues Brothers, he lost control of the NSPA when his subordinates went through his desk and found pictures of him having sex with boys and like early teens in their Nazi headquarters sometimes, and that made Collin was arrested and jailed for that. I can't tell. I know that, Antifa International has a list of various far-right and white supremacist figures who've been arrested for pedophilia or similar crimes against children. It's a constant feature of that movement. I didn't have the good theoretical apparatus to talk about either that or the role of misogyny, which is very important, especially for these countercultural figures who are explicit misogynists, and about how that bonded them together with Mason, or how some of them traded. Moynihan and Mason were trading pornography, including like a guide to bestiality. It was like how to have sex with different animals, clearly written by somebody who had some experience, which popped up in the Atomwaffen stuff. I think one of the Atomwaffen leaders actually refers to it about Mason having it. I was like, I read a copy of that. It's pretty strange stuff. You could actually find a copy online, which I found almost more disturbing, like on the open internet, not the dark web or Telegram channels or something. So yeah, I record some of this, and I'm just very explicit about what I found in the letters. I'm not quite sure how to put it together. When I started this project, even in 2018, there was limited scholarly writing about the far right still, especially in America. There's more stuff in Europe where the big right-wing populist parties had been, quite strong for almost 20 years by that point. And so I didn't quite know how to put it together. I would like someone else to take that material and run with it. If you're a scholar or a serious researcher and you want to do that, I will provide you with the copies I have. I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. It's clearly an important thing. It's not just like these Nazis had a view on gender. Everyone has a view on gender. Like there was the gender and sex questions were really very important in some way, but I couldn't quite tell you how they are. I think someone needs to put that together with a better theoretical framework than me.
One thing reading the book I was really struck by was how central this ideology that James Mason cooked up in the 70s is to some of the accelerationist neo-Nazism today. Like it's really core. Things like if you're going to go out and kill people, make sure you kill the right people, make sure you do enough murder. Even just the way that he would celebrate these killings you see on Telegram, the saints calendars where they say, Saint Brenton Tarrant did this on March 15, these other saints committed these crimes. His legacy really has lived on.
Oh yeah, for sure. He concentrates on these Nazi or supposedly neo-Nazi or other racist murderers and talks about them in a way that's very similar to how they've been beatified, right, in the current day. I actually, for better or worse, one of the appendixes, there's like 10 appendixes, go through all of the ones he mentions and explain who they are. And there were some really nasty people there, and a lot of them were clearly just disturbed people. Mason wants to make them all into these heroic, political figures, but some of them were like one guy. Well, he started as a guy and then he transitioned and then went back and then transitioned again, murdered like different people. Like he might have tried to pick them up and then murdered them. Like it was really like not like, oh, I'm going to go out, I'm a Nazi, I'm going to go kill Jews and black people, right? It was really a lot of these strange situations. Or a friend, the serial killer, Joseph Paul Franklin, Franklin at some point just kills his girlfriend, right? This isn't a political murder. So yeah, it's very much picked up on that. He's very much like, if you're gonna engage in the, he says total attack or total dropout is his slogan. If you're going to engage in total attack and you're going to throw your life away or you're going to die, and he says you should die in the attack, make it count, make it very public, make it look good. He's very much like Julius Evola in this case. He runs parallel to him in many ways. Mason never read him, or at least not until recently. I asked him this specifically. But there's a sort of like, violence isn't going to overthrow the system, but like you can make a splash with it, to do it very carefully. Mason advocate. There's some things that the modern people who say they follow Mason don't do. Mason says die in the attack. That's important. And he also says don't form membership groups. He's an early advocate of lone wolf actions. Even before Louis Beam, who wrote the very influential essay Leaderless Resistance, Beams writes that in 83, and Mason's already publishing Siege in 80. And he praises some of this stuff before. He already gets these ideas in the late 70s. And so the other thing he says is don't form membership organizations, which is, of course, what Atomwaffen was. Mason ended up announcing the dissolution of Atomwaffen, and you can tell in the announcement that he was unhappy. What it looked like is that Atomwaffen was going to be banned in the U.S., and normally you can't prescribe a group here. But you can prescribe. There is a foreign terrorist organizations which are prescribed, and since Atomwaffen had an official affiliate overseas, it looked like that was going to happen to them. So Mason did the announcement disbanding the group, in order to head this off. But you can see in the announcement that he was sort of like not happy that the group was worked in that way, because he always said don't form a group, don't have memberships, act on your own. He was reacting against this stuff in the 70s where these micro parties, and they had leaders and they had dues and they had a newspaper and they had a headquarters. And he was like, and they had very conservative cultural norms about hair. He railed against the haircut had to be a certain way in the party. And this National Socialist Liberation Front was partly a break, because they're like, oh, you can have long hair. We dress in fatigues. We look like hippie counterculturalists, but we're Nazis. And Mason hated the control over people's clothes and hair and the parent party and the NSWPP. So he's like, let's get rid of all of this stuff. And so some of this, and along with this, get rid of organizations, don't have any records of stuff, don't pay any money, just go and do it. So that was, in a sense, Atomwaffen and the other more formalized groups violated that dictum. In fact, the way it's sort of set up now with just these like random Telegram channels like called Terrorism, just having these discussions and promoting these ideas is more like what Mason, and engaging in all kinds of extreme stuff. You always hear about like pornography and, ISIS videos and stuff are circulated on these channels. Like that's much more true to Mason's vision.
Well, Spencer, we'll have to leave it there just before we go. What's next?
What's next? Well, I'll be in Europe for a month giving talks about this and related subjects. I will be you can find this stuff. I'll put it up on my website. I'll be in Hamburg on May 29th and 31st. I'll be in Berlin on June 4th and 6th. I will be in Oslo on June 10th. I'll be in Leipzig on June 13th. And I'll be in London on June 19th and 20th. And maybe one talk before, if I can set it up, specifically about neofolk and industrial. And after that, I don't know. I would like to write a book about National Socialism in America from the 1920s to the present, because we've now, everywhere, but there's now been a century of National Socialism, and it's existed here. It's a sort of looking like a permanent political strain. And one doesn't, like I said about this scholarship on the 70s neo-Nazis, there isn't a single standalone book about National Socialism in the U.S., which is, I think, kind of strange. So I'd like to write that, but we got to see if we can find a publisher. So that's what's up in the immediate future. But a lot of my writings are on my Patreon. You can buy the book from Routledge. You can look on their website, of course, get it through Amazon or whatever. They sell ebooks too, if it's difficult to get print copies wherever the listeners are. So that's my immediate plans.
Well, look forward to it. If people want to find you, you are on x.com at transform6789, and that Patreon is patreon.com/Spencer Sunshine. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show as always.
Well, folks, we'll be back next week. See you later.
When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide. I get to the top, well, I go for a ride. I get to the bottom and feel again. Well, feel again. Do you don't want me to love you? I'm coming down fast, but it might above you. Well, tell me, come on, baby, tell me the answer. You may be a lover, but you ain't no dancer. Helter skelter, helter skelter, helter skelter. Do you don't want me to meet you? I'm coming down fast, but now let me break you. Oh, tell me, come on, baby, tell me the answer. You may be a lover, but you ain't no dancer, no. Helter skelter, helter skelter, helter skelter. Yeah, I'm on, turn on the power. When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide. I get to the top, I go for a ride. I get to the bottom, I do again. I do again. Do you don't want me to love you? I'm coming down fast, but I'm out above you. Oh, tell me, come on, baby, tell me the answer. You may be a lover, but you ain't no dancer. Helter skelter, 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 helter skelter. Helter skelter, coming down on you. Helter skelter.
Get ready to add your support during our annual Radiothon.
Sound on for solidarity.
3CR Radiothon fundraiser, June 2024.
To donate, call 039419 8377 or donate online at 3cr.org.au.
3CR Radiothon 2024.
Sound on for solidarity.
Stand in solidarity with Palestine this Sunday.
Hi, it's Nasser Mashni from Palestine Remembered, Australia's only dedicated show on Palestine. Join me every Saturday morning at 9:30 and very importantly, get along to our rallies. Sunday, 12 o'clock, State Library. Join us.
We have to mobilise to show our support for Palestine. 12 p.m, State Library, this Sunday.
Rally to demand freedom and justice for Palestine. No war on Gaza.
Free Palestine Melbourne is a 3CR supporter.